Welcome everyone to this month's edition of the Psych Central free webinar series. My name is Gabe Howard and I'm the host of the Psych Central Show podcast, and I'll be your host for the evening as well. Today's presentation is titled How Mothering Helps Us Value Our Flaws and is being presented by Lisa Marciano. In a moment, she'll introduce herself and begin her presentation, but let's get some housekeeping items out of the way real quick. One, immediately following the presentation, we'll open up the Q&A. I will moderate and ask Lisa your questions. At any time during the presentation, you can type your questions in, but we'll save them for the end to answer. Two, all of your microphones are all muted, so don't worry, we can't hear you eat, drink, or post on Facebook. Three, when the presentation is over, we will post the recorded webinar on Psych Central's YouTube channel over the next few days. You can visit that channel by going to youtube.com/psychcentral. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and I'd like to hand the microphone over to Lisa.
Okay, thanks very much, Gabe. I have just one quick housekeeping item myself, which is that you might want to take a minute and grab some paper and a pen, as there will be a couple of places during the webinar tonight when I will suggest brief journaling exercises. I'll also be mentioning a couple of books throughout tonight's webinar, and I will include those references in the last slide. So when I come to the journaling prompts, of course you don't need to journal. You can just sort of think your answers. But if you think you want to journal, maybe just take a second now to grab that. Okay, I'm Lisa Marciano. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a certified Jungian analyst. I've been in practice for about 20 years. I have a parenting blog at Psych Central called Big Picture Parenting that focuses on the same thing that tonight's webinar is going to focus on, which is how mothering can be a catalyst for personal growth. I have a website where I offer virtual workshops on this topic as well, and that site, which is under construction right now, but it should be ready soon, is motherhoodtransformation.com. And you can find me on Twitter at Lisa Marciano. I'm also a mom. So let me tell you a little bit about how I became interested in this topic. To become a Jungian analyst, you have to go through many years of training, and I started doing this training around the same time that I became a mom. So my son and daughter were born about 2 years apart, and so therefore I had a toddler and an infant. And of course, no one slept for about 5 years in my house, and I found the whole experience, wonderful, but also incredibly overwhelming and difficult. So I was juggling these two small children and also this fairly intense process of analytic training, which involves a lot of close attention to what was going on for me psychologically. And I was really surprised to realize that in dealing with these incredibly mundane but also very difficult challenges of parenting, I was growing and changing a lot. I think it took me by surprise because I had grown up with the impression that being a mother often hampered a woman's growth and development. I was a kid in the 1970s, and there was a lot of talk about women's liberation, and I saw my own mother deal with a lot of frustration as a result of not having opportunities to develop her talents. So I had always assumed that whatever else motherhood might be, it would be a kind of personal diminishment. But then, I became very interested in this idea that being a mother was an opportunity for psychological growth. And it has been a topic I've been exploring, reading about, writing about, teaching, and of course, living for the past decade and a half. My thoughts on this topic were, of course, influenced by my training in Jungian analysis, and that's the primary lens that I see it through. I'm not going to talk about Jung very much today, but there is one key idea that we will need, so I'm just going to jump right to that. So Carl Jung was a contemporary of Freud and an early explorer of the unconscious. He coined many terms that have become commonplace, like archetype, extroversion, synchronicity. But one of his most powerful ideas is also one of his simplest, the notion of the shadow. Jung noted that as children, we are taught by parents, teachers, and society at large that certain aspects of ourselves are less acceptable and we learn that we need to hide these away. Over time, we all develop a nice collection of traits and qualities that we keep hidden. We may sort of know that they are there, but we'd rather not think about them. Or we may work very hard to convince ourselves that we are not those things. And you can see this really pithy quote here, "The shadow is the thing a person has no wish to be." So Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is a famous literary example of the shadow. And if you remember this story, Dr. Hyde is very proper and good and well respected, while Dr. Jekyll does all of these things that Hyde wants to do but can't because they aren't socially acceptable. And just for fun, let's see if this works. The sound may not be very good on this, but it doesn't need to be. It's just a little visual. Okay, well, for most of us, our shadow stuff won't be as evil as Mr. Hyde. In fact, though the shadow always does contain elements that are troubling and difficult and ought to be repressed, Jung once said that the shadow is 99% pure gold. What did he mean by that? To answer that question, let's maybe do a little experiment. So you can journal this if you like, or you can just think about your answers. So think about someone who really gets under your skin. It might be someone that your friends or partner agree is a little bit irritating, but your response to that person is stronger than theirs. You get annoyed even thinking of this person. You might even admit that you like to hate this person. Once you have that person in mind, I want you to answer this question. What is the thing that most annoys you about him or her? So take a minute and think about it. When you have that answer, I am willing to bet that you have just named a quality that is in the shadow for you. It is something you weren't allowed to do or be, and so you stuffed it down, but it is there just beneath the surface, and that is why you feel so bothered when you see someone else living it out. So I'll share my own example quickly. I once worked with a woman named Elise, and this is not actually a picture of Elise. This is a stock picture, but I think you'll see why I picked it. She really irritated me. There was nothing really terribly awful about her. You know, people generally liked her, but I couldn't stand her. And my skin crawled whenever I interacted with her. I became curious about this, so I asked myself, why? What bothered me the most about Elise was that she was pretty and she knew it. She felt very confident about her own attractiveness and enjoyed being the center of attention because of that. She would flirt and burble and chatter as if she took it for granted that we would all agree that she was pretty great and charming and deserving of our admiration. Well, feeling confident in that way was something that was definitely frowned upon in my house growing up. Above all, we were never supposed to boast, brag, or show off. Elise was living out that quality that I had been disallowed and had been made to feel ashamed for. So here's where the gold comes in. Usually those parts of ourselves that we have been stuffing down have a lot of vitality in them. Reconnecting and reincorporating them can fill our lives with a renewed sense of energy and meaning, especially in the second half of life. For example, it was important for me to reclaim my desire to show off a little bit and be the center of attention. That's a natural need we all have, and it can be healthy. And look, here I am doing a webinar. Probably not something I would have done if I hadn't made friends with my inner Elise. So what does any of this have to do with being a mom? Sometimes our kids do something that we see ourselves in right away. Maybe they are anxious and panicky, and we have a tendency to be that way too. We've always been anxious, and we see our kid melting down at the birthday party, or we see our teenager make himself sick worrying about the class trip to Six Flags or something, and we think, oh no, he's just like me. What have I done? I've passed on this trait either through nature or nurture, and now he's just going to be messed up for the rest of his life like I am. And when this happens, this can also be an opportunity to relate differently to aspects of ourselves we don't like. That's because when we see our worst traits in our children, we're sort of invited to relate to those parts of ourselves with renewed compassion and hopefully acceptance. But I'm looking at something a little bit different here. Tonight, I want to focus on how our kids can help us learn something new about ourselves, something we didn't consciously realize about ourselves before. Sooner or later, our kids are going to live out those very parts of ourselves we haven't wanted to know about. We will see them be the Mr. Hyde to our Dr. Jekyll. Though all parents find aspects of their children's behavior irritating, there are likely things that your kid does that makes you cringe, that make you feel like you want to crawl into a hole with extreme discomfort or embarrassment. Whenever feelings seem to have an extra energy charge, it's probably the case that shadow might be at work. When this happens, we have an opportunity to be curious about our reaction and what we can learn about ourselves. Our children likely won't have learned yet to hide these parts of themselves, at least if they're very young. So we can see our own disowned qualities lived out brazenly by our children And this gives us an opportunity to reclaim those parts of ourselves. So I'm going to tell you part of a fairy tale because Jungians love fairy tales, and this one illustrates this idea in metaphorical language. After the fairy tale, I'll go on to give a few examples. Before I start with a tale, take a minute to think about a time when you've been really irritated by one of your children. Maybe you were completely mortified about something that they did in public. Maybe you were incredibly disappointed with them for some reason. Whatever that thing is, it should be like a hot feeling, an emotion that seems disproportionate, that makes you uncomfortable when you even think about it, and it would probably be embarrassing to admit that you feel this way. So this is a time when, if you want, you can maybe do a little bit of journaling about that. If you have more than one child, it might be that you are aware of one of them being much easier than the other. Maybe there is one child that you recognize as being more like you, and that can be a certain kind of struggle. I mean, in some ways, that's very difficult. Sometimes it can be very hard to deal with a child who we see as similar to ourselves. But if we have a child who feels very different from us, or at least very different from us sometimes, dealing with them presents a different set of difficulties. Maybe we love to see them do things we can't imagine doing, but maybe we also feel at times really horrified by their behavior. So for this exercise, I'm more interested in your identifying those things that your kids do that feel completely foreign, those things that your kid doesn't make you think, oh, where did he come from? So especially if those feelings that get evoked are negative. Okay, so just remember your answers, and now we're going to do the fairy tale. The fairy tale is from Norway, and it is called Tatterhood. Once upon a time, a queen was very sad because she had no children. Every time she went out and saw their parents with their babies, she was beside herself with grief. At last, she sought advice from a poor beggar woman who promised to help her. The beggar woman instructed the queen to bathe in 2 pails of water, then empty these under her bed before going to sleep. In the morning, she would find 2 flowers growing under the bed, one foul with black leaves and putrid stench, and the other fair and fragrant. The beggar woman instructed her to eat the beautiful flower, but warned her that she was under no circumstances to consume the black, ugly flower. The queen did what the beggar woman advised her to do. She had the water brought up in 2 pails, washed herself in them, and emptied them under the bed. And when she looked under the bed the next morning, there stood 2 flowers. One was ugly and foul and had black leaves, but the other was so bright and fair and lovely, she had never seen anything like it, so she ate it up at once. But the pretty flower tasted so sweet that she couldn't help herself. She ate the other one too, for she thought, I'm sure that it can't hurt or help me much either way. Well, sure enough, after a while, the queen was brought to bed. First of all, she had a girl who had a wooden spoon in her hand and rode upon a goat. She was disgusting and ugly, and the very moment she came into the world, she bawled out, Mama! If I'm your mama, said the queen, God give me grace to mend my ways. Oh, don't be sorry, said the girl and the goat, for one will soon come after me who is better looking. After a while, the queen had another girl who was so beautiful and sweet that no one had ever set eyes on such a lovely child. You may be sure that the queen was very well pleased. The elder twin they called Tatterhood, because she was always so ugly and ragged, and because she had a hood which hung about her ears in tatters. The queen could hardly bear to look at her. The nurses tried to shut her up in a room by herself, but it did no good. She always had to be where the younger twin was, and no one could ever keep them apart. One Christmas Eve, when they were half grown up, there arose a frightful noise and clatter in the hallway outside the queen's apartment. Tatterhood asked what it was that was making such a noise outside. Oh, said the queen, it isn't worth asking about. But Tatterhood wouldn't give in until she found out all about it. And so the queen told her it was a pack of trolls and witches who had come there to celebrate Christmas. So Tatterhood said that she would just go out and drive them away. In spite of all they could say, and however much they begged and asked her to leave the trolls alone, she just had to go out and drive the witches off. She begged the queen to be careful and keep all the doors shut tight so that not one of them would open the least bit. Having said this, off she went with her wooden spoon and began to hunt out and drive away the hags. All the while there was such a commotion out in the gallery that the like of it had never been heard before. The whole palace creaked and groaned as if every joint and beam were going to be torn out of its place. Now, I can't say exactly what happened, but somehow or other one door did open a little bit, and her twin sister just peeped out to see how things were going with Tatterhood and put her head a tiny bit through the opening. But pop! Up came an old witch and whipped off her head and stuck a calf's head on her shoulders instead. And so the princess ran back into the room on all fours and began to moo like a calf. When Tatterhood came back and saw her sister, she scolded them all and was very angry because they hadn't kept better watch, and asked them what they thought of their carelessness now that her sister had been turned into a calf. "But I'll see if I can't set her free," she said. Well, as you might suspect, clever Tatterhood does eventually succeed in rescuing her beautiful sister, and the two go on to have several adventures together. In the end, Tatterhood meets a prince who is wise enough to see her for what she truly is, and both sisters are happily married. So in the story, the queen has the child she consciously wants, the one who is pretty and compliant and fits in with all the expectation that the external world has for us. But she also has another daughter that she secretly craves, the daughter that embodies all of those unacceptable qualities that haven't been allowed in her queenly life. It happens sometimes in families with multiple children that one child carries the positive qualities and another the negative, and this can be a burden for both children. However, another way to understand this story is to see both daughters as aspects of the same person. Sometimes our child is like the fair daughter, and sometimes he or she is like Tatterhood, right? That's true for all of us. As an example, my son can be very charming. He is funny and personable and is generally well-liked by peers and adults. And naturally, I feel full of pride when I hear his teachers praise him or see him achieve in academics or extracurriculars. But at home, he can be selfish and mean to his sister and rude to me and his father. And sometimes he does really stupid things that hurt other people. Then it does seem to me that his behavior doesn't reflect my conscious values at all. I can relate to the queen in the fairy tale when she doesn't even like to look at her daughter. Although I don't literally find it hard to look at my son at these times, I do find it unpleasant to look at what he has done. But of course, the story makes a very important point that those qualities that we find least acceptable in ourselves or our children are often the very qualities that we most need to get in touch with. These are the qualities we might most need in a crisis. Our better natures, our fair children, would be pretty defenseless if we didn't all also have a Tatterhood side that didn't care what people thought and wasn't ashamed to raise hell if necessary. You know, you don't fight life's trolls and witches by being sweet and nice. In my own example above, I can tell you that when my son steps over the line and does something that makes me feel ashamed of him, it is usually because he said something without regard for another's feelings. Now, as a general rule, this isn't okay. We have to be thoughtful of others. However, there are times in life when it is very important to have the courage to say something that might upset someone else. The person who speaks his truth, even when it is an unpopular opinion, can play a very important role and find himself in a position of leadership. So while as his parent I am very interested in teaching him to be respectful and kind and to use judgment and discernment in what he shares, I can also see the positive aspect of this tendency. Because this behavior of his bothers me so much, I suspect there is something I need to learn here. I need to reclaim my ability to be brutally honest when necessary, even when it will make others unhappy. Now, I would like to share the story of one of my clients with her permission. And of course, names and details are going to be changed. The story concerns my client Celine, who has an adult daughter named Katie. Celine's own mother was alcoholic. She was harsh, critical, strict, and cold. Celine learned when growing up that many parts of herself were unacceptable. She had been punished explicitly for being assertive and for putting her own needs first. By the time she came to see me, she had lived most of her life putting other people first and being unaware of what she really needed or wanted. She also had a hard time asking for what she wanted or needed when she was aware. Celine had 2 adult children, David and Katie. When the kids were young, David was very quiet and compliant, a little bit like Celine, but Katie was a wild child. She was spirited and feisty. Celine found parenting Katie difficult at times. Katie could be loud and demanding. Because Celine was a loving and connected mom, very much unlike her own mother, Katie grew up to be in touch with what she wanted and needed, and she could be very persistent in going after it. She was a bit of a mischief maker and frequently got in trouble at school. Celine adored Katie and appreciated her spunk, but Katie's outside-of-the-line style often left Celine feeling embarrassed and self-critical. She would be deeply mortified when Katie came home with a note from the teacher again. She was ashamed to realize that sometimes she found herself wishing that Katie would just be easy like her brother. When Celine was in her 40s, she began to find her own feisty impulses that had years ago been driven underground, reasserting themselves as she entered the second half of life. She had long found her marriage stultifying, and now she began to yearn for freedom and to discover other parts of herself. Of course, she felt tremendously guilty about all of this. Assertiveness and entitlement were qualities she had long ago been taught to push out of the way. She would try on being a little more assertive or adventurous. The experience would be terrifying but also exhilarating. Afterwards, a power inner critical voice would berate her for what she had done. For example, she planned a trip to Europe without her husband to attend a workshop. While there, she drank wine, danced, flirted, and did many other things that she had rarely allowed herself to do. When she returned home, she felt tremendous guilt for having broken the rules. For a little while, she was paralyzed by the fear that something terrible would happen to her or her kids as punishment. Celine was going through a process of growth and reclamation of long ago split-off shadow contents. While this was going on, she received inspiration from her dreams. Following is one dream she had around this time. Okay, so this is the dream. I am outside on a large grassy field, and long tables are set up on the grass in no particular order, but they are loaded with food. Each table seems to have a different kind of food: deli stuff, Mexican food, Greek food. I am milling around outside these tables that are ringed with people. I have an empty plate, and I want some of the food, but I can't get in. More accurately, no one offers to let me in, and I don't ask. I keep on milling around outside. Then, out of the sky to the right of where I am, a bunch of young people drop onto a designated area with mats on the ground. I ask someone who they are, and I am told that they are FBI trainees. My daughter, Katie, is one of the young people. We are all watching the trainees as they go through various physical exercises which demonstrate their amazing endurance and fitness. They do some other things, and then they proceed to pass by us all as if they are in a graduation ceremony. Katie and the others pass by me, and I sense that Katie is a popular girl. They pass by me looking ahead, sort of smiling, kind of like they are quietly proud. When they pass close to me, Katie turns around to look at me, and it is like I am looking at myself in the mirror. I am staring right into my own face. I am shocked and surprised, and I wake up. The dream starts with images of tables laden with food, but Celine can't get close enough to get any and consequently has an empty plate. This image indeed describes Celine's lived experience for much of her life. She saw that there were many wonderful things on offer in the world, but she wasn't in touch with the assertiveness that would allow her to take some of these things. Then her daughter arrives with other young people who are training to be part of some elite police force. When I asked Celine, as we were discussing this dream, what she thought about the FBI, she said that they often did, quote unquote, bad things, but in the interest of accomplishing something important. Murray Stein, who's a Jungian analyst, likens the shadow to a country's secret espionage system that operates without the explicit knowledge of the head of state, who is therefore allowed to deny culpability. In the fairy tale, Tatterhood does the queen's dirty work, riding forth to chase the witches away, even when the queen wishes to not even speak about those witches. In Celine's dream, Katie is just such a figure. She and her peers are able to use their fitness and endurance that are ultimately in the interest of wholeness and growth, even if this means behaving in a quote-unquote bad way. The dream ego is that part played by ourselves in the dream and usually indicates our conscious personality. Celine's dream ego is unable to harness enough assertive energy to claim any space at the table. But at the end of the dream, she recognizes herself in the strong, heroic figure of her daughter. Now, take a moment to think back to the question that I asked you before about the thing that your kid does that horrifies you or mortifies you, the thing where you think, he must have gotten that from his dad because that is not me. If you wrote it down, you can answer the following questions by journaling as well. How would you characterize the thing about that behavior that drives you mad? Is it selfish? Is it silly? Crass? Whiny? Clingy? Greedy? How did your parents feel about that quality? What did you learn about that quality when you were growing up? How do you feel when you imagine yourself having that quality? For example, if you ever behave in a way that is whiny, clingy, or selfish, how does that make you feel? Does it feel very forbidden? Can you see how accessing a little bit of that quality might be helpful to you? Perhaps there is an important challenge you are facing or have faced. Do you think you might be able to handle that challenge better if you allowed yourself to be a little more this way, whatever this way is? How would your life change if you had a little bit more of that quality? So you can take a minute to either just think about that or journal a bit. And if anyone, has an answer that they would like to share during the Q&A, I'd love to hear it. Just make sure not to reveal any personal details that could be identifying. So I have another example because I think examples help us understand this. These are complicated ideas, actually. This is an extended quote from a book called The Matrix and Meaning of Character, an Archetypal and Developmental Approach by Jungian analyst Nancy Dougherty and Jacqueline West. And again, I'll have that reference at the end. So this is the story of Joan. Okay. Joan had been the favorite daughter of a popular politician. Her mother was his beautiful, loyal wife, an energetic and competitive public relations woman who seemed to drive her father's career. Joan reported that her life had been picture perfect until her daughter Jessica reached adolescence seemingly in dark turmoil. Joan had an adoring husband, beautiful and well-behaved children, and an enviable career on the faculty of a law school. She was accomplished and self-confident. While she was admirable and admired, her subtle superiority provoked envy from others. Joan began therapy as a result of concern that she had about a radical change in her daughter, Jessica. Jessica became discouraged in middle school, apparently subsequent to a disappointing academic performance. Although Joan and her husband pulled out all the stops in avid encouragement, tutors, after-school classes, remedial computer programs, it began to become apparent to them all that Jessica would never be able to compete at the level her parents hoped for. Soon after that, Jessica became increasingly withdrawn from and angry with both of them. Jessica began to dress, as Joan described, with a dark eccentricity. At first, Joan responded to her daughter with what she perceived as gracious offers to buy Jessica new clothes that were more appropriate for a girl her age, have her hair done to make her feel better, and repaint and fix up her bedroom to lighten her mood. Jessica responded to her mother's cajoling by upping the stakes. Day by day, odd, dangerous-looking jewelry began to appear at the dinner table. Friends with attitudes dark and sullen, who seemed to be considerably older than Jessica, began to appear at their door. At this point, Joan denied the extent of these troubling changes in Jessica and responded by withdrawing from her daughter. Jessica, in turn, began to wear all black, painted her fingernails, and finally dyed her beautiful blonde tresses black. Joan found herself in a panic. She tried to write off Jessica's goth persona as a phase, yet she felt incredible shame about appearing with her in public and angry about being exposed to this dark and untidy world. Where had she failed? This was the first blemish in her well-constructed life, the first chink in her armor. It was at this point that she sought out analysis. She loved her child, and the degree of shame that she felt about Jessica's appearance was shocking and sobering to her, as was her inability to constructively intervene in what she perceived as an increasingly dangerous situation. All of this wounded her sense of pride on many levels. After several years of analysis, Joan began to appreciate how the defense of perfection that had provided her with such success in her life up to now made it impossible for her to manage this crisis with her daughter. In fact, it had actually fueled Jessica's acting out. The depth of her shame became the ground upon which her capacity to develop empathy was born. She recognized that she used her brilliance in an unrelated manner that evoked envious responses from others. Over time, Joan became able to recognize the way she devalued others to feed her sense of being. Joan was able to work with the realization that her perfect adaptation to life was a defensive compensation for the shame she felt as a child when her own witchy mother used and rejected her in order to maintain her mother's image of perfection. Joan came to understand that at a young age she had rejected her connection to herself as a woman. And Joan, the book goes on to describe how Joan was really able to sort of incorporate some of what Jessica was acting out so that Jessica didn't have to act it out anymore. And then Joan could go on and live a fuller version of her life and also free her daughter to do the same. Okay, the next thing I wanted to do was, again, sort of more examples. This time I wanted to use an example from a film. So I have a couple of film clips from the 1980 film Ordinary People. And I am a little unsure of how the sound is going to work. So you might have to turn up your volume for these. Okay, for those of you that have not seen the film begins a few weeks after Conrad Jarrett, a high school student in a suburb of Chicago, has come home from an extended stay at a psychiatric hospital following a suicide attempt. As the movie unfolds, we learn that Conrad became depressed and suicidal after surviving a boating accident in which his older brother Buck was killed. Buck was the family star and his mother's favorite child. While we are not told much about Conrad's relationship with his mother before Buck's death, we learn that she has never been close to Conrad. It is likely that Conrad has always been the recipient of her shadow projections. He was not the star swimmer that his brother was. But after Buck's death, Conrad carries the shadow element of grief and that his mother cannot feel. The brittle Beth Jarrett, who's played by Mary Tyler Moore, is unable to grieve her son's death. She is in a hurry to have life get back to normal and is cut off from her. Conrad feels what she cannot, and so, as we will see in the following clip, she can barely stand to be around him. All right, I think I'm going to just do, I have a bunch of these, but I think I'm going to do maybe 2 of them. Let's not do that one. Let's try this one. Okay, and let's do, oh dear, sorry, I'm not really sure what that was. Okay, let's try this one. This will be the last one. Here we go. Well, it looks like it's not loading, but I think you got a flavor of it there. Beth doesn't, in fact, manage to do what my client Celine did, which was to kind of reclaim those shadow qualities, or what the Queen in Tatterhood does, which is, eventually to embrace those repudiated qualities that our children act out. She doesn't learn to value the despised and rejected parts of herself that she sees lived out in her son, and by the end of the film, Beth leaves the family for good. So the opposite of good is not bad. The opposite of good is authentic. That's one of my favorite quotes that Jungian analyst James Hollis says sometimes. When we are too concerned with living up to other people's standards, we can lose touch with our authentic reactions. This can cut us off from an important source of vitality and an opportunity for growth and renewal. Young children haven't learned yet to censor themselves and will frequently engage in behavior that will remind us of those traits we have not allowed ourselves to claim. Our own children are likely to be particularly adept at acting out the most despised parts of ourselves. We may be like the Queen, wanting to hide away those parts of our children that remind us of things we don't want to know about ourselves. But if we can muster up the courage to be curious about our reactions, we might just find that our children can help us reconnect with important parts of ourselves that we forgot were there. And that's it for my presentation tonight, so I'm ready for your questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. The first question that popped up is, what's the opposite of bad?
What is the opposite of bad?
Yeah, if the opposite of good is authentic, then what's the opposite of bad?
Maybe fake, maybe inauthentic. I don't know, I'd have to think about that more. I mean, I think the sense of that quote, and also, you know, when I was talking about in the dream about how sometimes, you know, the FBI does bad things, you know, it's that what is sort of good according to collective standards is often not, you know, it has a very different kind of sense when we're looking at it psychologically. And what might feel bad to us, you know, for example, in my personal story there, like being boastful felt really bad to me at a certain point in my life, you know, kind of putting myself out there, but it wasn't really bad, you know. It was just something that I had sort of learned that wasn't acceptable.
Excellent, wonderful. Thank you so much. The next question is in the example that you used of the goth daughter and it tying into the mother's childhood or experiences, what if your child is doing something that you just don't like that doesn't tie into your experience? I mean, what if you don't want them to dress goth, but they are?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's things that our kids do that we don't want them to do, that they shouldn't do, that's dangerous. And you know, listen, it's a parent's role to set limits, right? So, you know, it's absolutely appropriate to do that, but I guess I'm sort of suggesting that we could kind of listen with two ears. You know, we might have to say, listen, you can't dress like that, you can't wear that, I need you to do A, B, and C, and that's, you know, that's the parent's job. And we might be curious about why our kid is doing that, you know. So just trying to think here of another example. Okay, if we have a kid who's really saying, you know, just not doing her homework, just not doing well in school at all, of course the right thing to do is to make it clear that we have an expectation and, you know, that we need her to do her homework, and, you know, we're going to sort of impose that. And at the same time, we might kind of go off on our own and sort of ask ourselves, you know, why this, why now, and what might it be playing out in our relationship? You know, it might be that we can see how maybe we've overvalued that because we have some feelings of inadequacy. And so, you know, I think the point is that we, you know, families, relationships really are sort of complex psychological systems. And that the things that the people that we're in close relationships with, we're going to be sort of connected, especially parents, especially I think mothers and children, connected in these sort of complex psychological ways that can reflect back to us things about ourselves if we look at it that way. But it doesn't mean that we also are not parenting. But that's a good question. Thank you for asking that.
Thank you so much. And this is, as of right now, the last question. So if there's any other questions, please get them in. We do have time. But the question is how do you handle a disagreement with the co-parent? And then they put in parentheses, father, question mark.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's an interesting question. So if the parents disagree on something, you know, it's so hard to answer that because it sort of depends on the situation. But I think that, you know, I mean, that's a whole other layer, right? Because in terms of the tack that I'm taking here to sort of, you know, scratch the surface and see what's underneath. I mean, if it's a complex system between a mother and a child, you know, you throw in another parent and there's a whole lot going on. I mean, I definitely think that parenting is more effective if parents can get on roughly the same page. Sometimes to do that, you need to get professional help. You know, sometimes you need, you know, I think especially during adolescence, it can be really helpful to seek out some family therapy or at least some couples therapy. And, you know, family therapists are trained to look at things from a systems perspective, and they can kind of have a curiosity about how what the mom is doing might be influencing the kid, what might be kind of unconscious for the dad might be getting acted out with, you know, the kid. and how these kind of moving parts all impact each other.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And another question did pop up, which is, it says specifically, do you recommend family therapy, or is it something the parent should do alone?
That is a good question. Let me just think about that for a second. I think either can be really helpful. I think it partly depends on what's going on. Certainly, individual therapy can be a way for the mom to explore her kind of own inner terrain as it relates to this experience of parenting. And it can be really helpful too. Sometimes, I think especially mothers and daughters, for example, just tend to be very kind of enmeshed and kind of too connected, and the separation that has to happen, as the child gets older and enters adolescence can be really, really difficult. And individual therapy for the mom can absolutely help. But I would say that if it feels like a wider issue, if the kid's going off the rails more, mom might need some support there too on her own, but family therapy can be really, really helpful in just sort of untangling that.
Thank you so very much. That's all of the questions that we have for now. I really appreciate you being on the show and sharing your knowledge with everyone. Do you have any final words?
You're welcome. No, thank you. Thanks very much.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, everybody. That concludes this broadcast for the evening. We will see you next month.